So I had a couple of links. It seems to me that the one on Jefferson disappeared for some reason. So, but you could always, you've heard of Thomas Jefferson. So he's kind of easy to find. Seems like all of the stuff is still there. University of Virginia, they have archives on him and stuff. So it's not hard to find stuff on Jefferson. But the topic is Locke. And there's lots of stuff to talk about on Locke. But this was an article I couldn't have posted on the syllabus because it wasn't there yet. This is just a when did this one come out? I don't know when this was actually written, but I just saw it a couple weeks ago. But it really answered a lot of questions for me about John Locke. John Locke was puzzling. Well, Thomas Jefferson is puzzling. And the puzzle we get, of course, is when we're reading about these theorists, political theorists, philosophers who are arguing for equality, and starting liberalism, although I think officially Mill, John Stuart Mill, is the second one that we're looking at tonight, is the official starting point for liberalism, and that was because his book on liberty seems to be like the official starting point of the liberal point of view. Although that's probably not correct in modern jargon. You might say that, just roughly, that Mill's point of view is closer to what we might call a libertarian today. That would be my guess. I already said this, I'm getting deja vu. I don't know.
I think you skimmed over some of this
Did
last
I?
week, but we didn't go to it.
But, well, because Locke is important. If we talk about Hobbes, probably also mention Locke a little, because Hobbes, of course, gives us the social contract, the idea of a social contract as the legitimating narrative of our government. But Locke will revise that. He's one of the other social contract philosophers. He still accepts the idea that it is we, the people, somehow forming our contract with one another that gives us the form of government we want. But his understanding of the state of nature is different than Hobbes, where it's all security is the main issue. Locke, I'm pretty sure I mentioned, is convinced that your clan, family, basically has a loving relationship with most of the folks, and so it becomes not a matter so much of security as organization. It gets too complex, so what we have to do is form rules that we have to live by. That really makes a lot more sense, actually, than Hobbes. But still, they're British. They're both British, and they're both very much interested in property. Notice, so property is really higher than individual rights. You know, so your right to your property is more important than the other person's life. Basically, you know, if this is your property, you have to make sure that you get your property and it's protected, even if that other person is starving to death.
I was going to say, if my understanding of this, that the English language is in and of itself a very possessive language. So
That's interesting.
Makes
I haven't figured out how that might be, the way we use possessives. I don't know.
Well, much of the language deals in some sort of degree of ownership, you know, a not direct level, but it seems to hold pretty true.
There's a lot of debt involved in our transactions.
What is yours? What is
even
mine?
in moral
What is,
terms.
yeah.
I owe you, for something. We tend to think that way. Could be English. wouldn't be surprised, although the characteristics of the language grow through the use, and if the focus on theory is on property. And a lot of that seems to happen because of the move towards making profit. And those that had property began to want to make profit off of that property. They really hadn't before that. In fact, still today, a lot of the folks that own lots of property actually broke, because you don't make much money off of property unless there's some way you can get paid off of it. And if you're a fan of Jane Austen, you know that the property owners really just basically eked out a wealthy living off of all of the sharecropper farmers, what you didn't call them that. Because what they could afford to pay in order to keep the farm going really wasn't that much. So you could almost figure out, well, you could get 5,000 pounds over the year off of this estate, 10,000 pounds off of this estate. That pretty much stayed the same. If you started a factory, you could start making lots of money. Of course, you ended up with a lot of profit over that. So as the shift, so the different empires, the Dutch were the wind. The wind is what they made use of that enabled them to build an empire. Then the British used coal, and coal really enabled them to become incredibly rich. And then, of course, we're number 3 with oil. Where it's going to go after that, I don't know. It looks like it's going to be gas, and it looks like we're still the ones making the best out of that. I don't know how that's going to work out. But once that shift took place, you had everybody trying to make capital, which is why Marx got so upset, remember, over that. So it looked like a terrible deal for everyone. On the other hand, even Marx pointed out that this is the most dynamic system, economic system that's ever been developed, and it still is. It still is. I mean, it's not stable, that's for sure. We've all grown used to that idea, and it's not equal. It certainly isn't. As we look around, was that true? Real news about the folks in a convoy trying to get into Mexico today? Anybody follow that? Yeah. I've heard 2 sides to this. That the one is calling it fake news because how does that many people just happen to try to go north through Mexico right before the elections with the cameraman, to film them as they're heading. That looks like a setup.
It does sound like a border article, but at the same time, at this point,
who knows? Who knows? But clearly, there are places that people live in the world that are in way worse condition than us here. That's so. When you think of capitalism that way, it's clearly not an equal system all over. But when we look at Locke has an interesting concept of what gives you your property, and that is your elbow grease. That's pretty weird. So you think the natives of the forests along the east coast of what became the Americas. There were people there, lots of people actually, I guess, and they made use of their forests. The way they made use of their forests were the hunter-gatherer systems, although they did have farms. They grew crops, they hunted, they lived there, they moved around, they had fish camps, I suppose, the kind of typical thing. The Europeans arrive, and as far as they're concerned, these woods being wild like this clearly indicate that no one's using it. And so they chop it down and create Western European farms. And that to them means, okay, I've taken a raw material and transformed it with the sweat of my brow, or however I did it, my my slaves, I suppose. And I ended up now with all this property, right? I might even be given more property by the king. Initially, the king would just give people property, and he has the right because he's a Christian king, and wherever you're going, they're not Christians, so I have the right over them. That makes sense to me. Did I say that with enough irony to surprise everyone? Yeah, that was their thinking, right? But once you got there, if you transformed the nice pristine woods into a productive farm, as far as the Europeans were concerned, you owned the place. You deserve it. You've made it worth something. You build a house. By the way, we still have remnants of that kind of thing in Alaska. If you get one of those properties and you improve upon it within so many years, that's your requirement. So if you get a property off the road system somewhere,
I don't think they allow homesteading
you could,
anymore.
pardon?
So I don't think they allow homesteading anymore.
From what I understand, they still occasionally will sell a place or for cheap, but at that price you have to improve upon it. So you still have to like move a trailer out there, plow the road out through the woods.
Make it a viable system.
When
Yeah. Is
I
that,
lived
no?
in-
They're no longer doing that?
they are, cause,
They are?
well, I mean, unless they changed it in the last few years, because I lived in Washington not too long ago, and they would advertise it on the radio, that you could buy a piece of land for like, I don't know, a couple $100 or something, or $25 an acre or something like that. But there, but.
Here in Alaska?
In Alaska, but there's no, you had to like, there's no roads, there's no power lines or anything.
And if you didn't do anything with it, you lost it.
Well, I don't know, they didn't get that much into detail, but I do know that they were selling, because they wanted it to be occupied, they wanted it to be developed. And-
I know I've seen it since I've lived here, of course, that's been 30 years, so I don't know. The state still does that every once in a while. Yes?
Well, another thing is out in the valley, I mean, it wasn't that long ago that we were very colonial, and out in the valley you can see signs of there being literally old barns and tractors out there, some strangely antiquated things out there, and they haven't been there that long.
My son's mother-in-law, am I getting that relationship? His wife's mother and father own one of the farms out right near the state fair grounds.
Oh,
And 2 of those old barns are on their property, so they own 2 of those.
well, they own
Out on Inner Springer Loop.
yeah, I live out in
Down
that.
the- He grows hay and sod. And he has a store where he sells farming stuff.
I don't know what you're talking about, yeah.
So,
It's about that way.
but I know they weren't the original settlers, they bought the place. So, yeah, well, of course, that was the Palmer, the Dust Bowl, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Because, they recruited people from the Dust Bowl and sent them up here. And this,
With very mixed results, yeah.
yeah, mixed results, because they came up thinking that they had developed farms that they were moving into, and instead they discovered woods. Yeah,
So just looking it up in Google, according to alaskacenters.gov, the federal and state agencies in Alaska do not offer free land. Once in a while, the state of Alaska Department of Natural Resources, however, does have a public land sale program. And to me, that makes a little bit more sense because I was involved in us trying to get point possession, personally involved politically, in trying to get point possession to the Kenai Peninsula Borough to allow point possession as a homestead acreage. It's about 8,000 acres of undeveloped virgin land out the end of the North Road. They ran into a lot of pushback, and I think the last homesteads that were offered by Alaska were back in the 80s. The issue is, to my understanding, is that they've patented certain areas of land, so there's a patent that's on the land, and of course, we all know that we don't own any subsurface mineral rights. It's all public.
right, right.
And then I think 55% of the state of Alaska is actually federally controlled, and they have exclusive federal regulations, and the federal government's not offering homestead lands. Doesn't mean that they couldn't in the future, but there is no current program other than these little set-asides, which might be what you're referring to. They want to develop a certain amount of acreage or something, but it is interesting just in terms of the way we've evolved this concept of property, especially when you're talking about marks, because that's one of the last vestiges of the capitalist system that we still have, that and religion, which are part of what the Communist Manifesto is saying. We need to abolish private property, we need to abolish religion. And so I think those two things are one of the last remaining factors that we still hold dear here in the United States. But anyway, I just thought I'd put that.
Yeah.
You know, I've often wondered, I mean, because we bought our home just up the hill, where am I? Just up the hill.
Yeah.
In '87, when the Army shipped me up here, I volunteered, actually, to come up here. And in fact, my orders required that I buy quarters. I rent, you know, on the economy, right?
Right.
I wasn't assigned to quarters on post. I was given economy quarters. So the Army got to pay my mortgage and my utilities, et cetera, for the 4.5+ years that I served at Fort Ridge. But I've always wondered, okay, so I've got the deed, because it's been paid for now for 15+ years, whatever. So I've got the mortgage, I've got the deed, and I know I bought it from a person who lived in that house prior to my coming there, because I bought it from him and his family. Right? In fact, he was in the FBI, I know that. I know that while we were negotiating at the time, he was traveling through Canada with his family, heading to his next duty station, which was in Tennessee. And I know that it was a benefit to us because they settled for less than what they wanted, with no skin off their nose, because the FBI covered the difference. You know, so that was great. You know, so I got the money less, because at the time, '87, the homes here were practically being given away because of the there was a recession here. So we ended up getting that house. So I've got the deed, and I'm all happy that I've got this property that they can come out and they can measure exactly where it fits and ties into all the other plots up there, right? You've got the specific numbers. Of course, you got the address, but of course you've got the actual lot number, et cetera, which is actually different. But where did that come from? That takes us back, of course, to Anchorage just deciding, okay, we'll sell these lots, right?
Came from the pad.
What about the people that actually used to live here? They did not think of property that way. So the society that moved in basically said, okay, so this is how we do things, and we're going to do it, and all this property now we can sell for the municipality originally. And so they carved up Anchorage. Here's the lots. I remember in the book by what's his name? Shoot. Well, I know that. I'll go with 50 miles tomorrow. So Willie, in talking about his family, he was a kid, but he remembers in, what was it, Ketchikan? Not Ketchikan. It's on the West Coast. I forget the name of that. Why do I have trouble with that? I had a nap today, so I should be okay. But his family went off to fish camp one summer, and when they came back, they discovered that the mayor sold the land at an auction And all the white people that were there bought all the lots, including the lot that was their house. And so when they got back, they discovered they no longer owned their house, and they had to move. Because they just carved up the place and sold it. There was actually structures there too, right? So they just sold the whole thing. Well, no one was there. Well, they were out at fish camp, right? So, right? But they had no recourse. So basically, the city just stole the land from everyone, sold it for money. Of course, the city kept the money, right? But at the same time, now these people, for incredibly cheap prices, bought all this property that's now theirs. It had been native land, of course, before. You know that they did that on purpose. You knew that they knew, oh, they're all going to be out at fish camp this time of year, so let's do it now. Yeah. So it was theft that started it off, and you're not going to see that. That's really just Willie was a kid, so that's within his lifetime that property was stolen, and of course he's furious about it, and yet nothing can come of that at this point. But I wanted to read this, because if we're trying to figure out, we could already, everybody argues about Thomas Jefferson. I keep seeing new articles about what kind of person was he after all. He said all men are created equal, and yet it's pretty darn obvious he owned slaves. One of those slaves, Hensley, was his cousin. She was born of a slave, but her father was his uncle. So he owned slaves, and he had sex with his slaves that he felt like, and she was a child of that relationship. So she's basically, as just about as close to Jefferson as Thomas was, right? She's a little girl when he inherits her, right? And he takes her with him to Paris, and as she gets older, right? You're familiar with this. She ends up beginning to have children. I think she had more children than Thomas Jefferson's. Is this news, or are you all familiar with it?
I didn't know the part about Paris, but
I heard something about it. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, at least the first or second, maybe more, of her children were born while they were in Paris, when it's pretty obvious that she's his servant in Paris. So it's not like she had, who knows what her feelings were towards him, but they're cousins too. It's also interesting that his children by her appeared more Caucasian than his children by his wife. Is that fun? That's just an interesting biographical point. He was embarrassed when people would come to visit Monticello and they would think her kids were his children. Well, they were. But his children were slaves, and they weren't. So, this is the same guy that's famous for writing "All men are created equal." What on earth is he thinking? Well, he clearly isn't thinking the same way that we would today. For certain, he didn't think women were created equal. He clearly didn't free his slaves, even when he died, and that was George Washington did that, right? He freed his slaves as a gesture to his favorite slaves. He freed them, as I understand it. But Thomas Jefferson did not. And what was his thinking there? Well, I mean, on the one hand, he was apparently convinced that if they had been freed and released from their attachment to Monticello and basically his son's ownership, that they would be in horrible straits because they wouldn't be able to take care of themselves out in that vicious world out there. They were protected by being slaves on their property. That's one way of thinking about it, that it was for their benefit that he wanted to make sure that they weren't released, right? And the other thing too was that he kept buying so many books. I know how that is. He took all of his library up to Philadelphia to sell it, and once he sold it, he had all that money and he couldn't help himself. He bought a whole bunch more books. So he never got out of practically being bankrupt, because he kept adding new weird things to Monticello, right? He kept rebuilding and stuff. So you can analyze Thomas Jefferson like crazy, and everybody does. It seems like, there's all sorts of folks that are absolutely convinced that he's an asshole, because on the one thing he says what he does, but on the other hand, look how he treats people. So he's not being honest with us, right? On the other hand, maybe he was. Maybe he was doing the best he could. Maybe you really thought he was. But what about Locke? I mean, Locke comes across as being two-faced this way also, because on the one hand, in the second treatise, he's definitely against slavery, but in the earlier one, he's definitely pro-slavery. And he's also involved in a lot of transactions, official transactions regarding slaves. Well, that was very confusing to me, and I never read anything that explained how he could have done both. It sounded like here's another famous individual that we could go back and say he's clearly not speaking honestly with us. Well, this article really, I think, does a great job explaining it. So if you don't mind.
Oh, Malwarebytes.
I will read this to you. Is that all right? You can follow along if you like. It's a little long, but I don't think it's boring at all. So John Locke, who lived through 2 revolutions in 17th century England, remains perhaps the most important theorist about democracy. Translated into many different languages, Locke's ideas inform contemporary philosophical debates about justice and rights, from relative egalitarians such as John Rawls, to libertarians such as Robert Nozick, to Amartya Sen's critique of Western-based theories of justice. Locke's writings inspired the language of rebellion in the United States Declaration of Independence and Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract, which shaped the French Revolution. After the Second World War, Locke's ideas circumscribed debates over democracy and social justice within the United Nations and in international law. The principles that government should be based on the consent of the governed, that most people can make reasonable choices, that all men are created equal, that people have inalienable rights. His animosity towards hereditary privilege have had many critics too. Locke's influence probably reached its height in the 1960s. Since then, criticism has grown. On the right, critics see him as too idealistic and impractical. All people are not and cannot be equal. On the left, critics contend that Locke was a hypocrite, a philosopher who put forth radical ideas while working on behalf of slavery and colonialism. McPherson's The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism made the most influential case that Locke regarded private property above all, including property in slaves. Post-colonialist thinkers, in particular Uday Singh Mehta on liberalism and empire, saw Locke's philosophy as emblematic of Western ideas about democracy and rights that serve as a cover for the oppression of indigenous peoples. Implicating Locke in the causes of slavery and colonialism has cast a shadow over Western liberalism and indeed democracy itself. However, history tells a different story. Colonialism and slavery emerged from ideas and practices much older than Locke about the divine and absolute rights of kings. As a mid-level functionary in 17th century England, Locke directly encountered the realities of monarchy and inherited status. Such experiences opened his eyes. Over time, he came to believe that slavery was deeply wrong, that it was the most extreme instance of the evils of inherited status that infected the entire social order. Locke's celebration of consent defined his political theory. As his opposition to royal policies developed, he faced punishment for his radical ideas. During the English Civil War of 1649, Locke's father sided with Parliament and the principles of consent of the people. At the end of the war, King Charles I was tried for treason against his own people and executed on 30 January 1649. Locke was 16. His school was a 10-minute walk from Charles' execution site by the steps of Banqueting House, Whitehall, and he almost certainly witnessed and supported it. But after more than a decade of political instability, Locke supported a new king. In May 1660, in the person of Charles II, monarchy returned to England. London mobs and rival armies ready to fight each other, opening a specter of anarchy. Locke wrote that he would fight if only he knew for whom. 'Tis the great misery of this shattered and giddy nation that wars have produced nothing but wars, and the sword cut out work for the sword. Over the next few years, Locke lived in Oxford as a scholar and tutor, specializing in medicine and philosophy. He probably would have stayed there and written little of note had he not, in 1668, saved the life of Anthony Ashley Cooper, later the first Earl of Shaftesbury. Shaftesbury drew Locke into Stuart Court Restoration politics, into imperial governance, and into the thick of the king's promotion of slavery. Those who emphasize Locke's hypocrisy point to two pieces of evidence during this decade. First, they contend that Locke authored the fundamental constitutions of Carolina in 1669. By the way, Carolina is Latin for Charles, if you're curious, which explicitly supported hereditary nobility and slavery. Every free man of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves. Second, they show that Locke owned stock in the Royal African Company, which ran the African slave trade for England. And that's the fortress where the slaves were shipped from, Cape Coast Castle in Ghana. Of course, Locke's service to the Earl of Shaftesbury and involvement in the Stuart Court shaped his ideas, but his political philosophy developed in opposition to the policies and practices of Charles II's court, not in harmony. Locke's two treatises of government in 1689, which is the section of the text that we have, argued against the very root of slavery, inherited status, which derived from the same set of ordering ideas and commitments as the monarchy, the divine and hereditary rights of kings. Just as a prince is born the son of a king with the right to rule, a subject was born to a subject, and a slave born to a slave, each with the obligation to obey king and master. During 1660 to 85, England, under Charles II, pursued slavery vigorously, and not only because it helped to justify monarchy. Slaves helped to produce profitable crops such as sugar and tobacco that generated huge tax revenues for the monarch. By 1687, the tax revenue in the form of customs on these staples comprised a third of crown revenue, paying for the navy, the army, and much else. Charles II married Catherine of Braganza from Portugal for her dowry, which included forts off the African coast. He put his brother James in charge of a new Royal African Company to enable the slave trade. James led 2 wars against the Dutch to gain access to the slave trade. In England's colonies in the Americas, Charles II appointed royal governors who supported slavery and offered rewards of land to those who purchased slaves or indentured servants. In Virginia, the king offered 50 acres per slave or servant bought. Thus, some men accrued estates of 20,000 acres and more. Charles II's judges presided over court decisions, especially one in 1677 that said that those who were aliens, that is, not subjects, had no rights under the law and could be considered simple property. Historians have long noted Locke's role in drafting the Carolina constitutions and its protections for slavery. The implication is not so much personal hypocrisy as evidence that Western liberalism, from its foundational theorists, promoted slavery. But such a story is based on a misapprehension of Locke's position. So this is her interpretation of this, right? In terms of the Carolina constitutions, Locke was a secretary. He drafted a legal document as a lawyer drafts a will. He composed it for the 8 men who owned the Carolinas, given to them as a reward by Charles II. These men desired that the government of this province may be made most agreeable to the monarchy under which we live. They sought to avoid erecting a numerous democracy. The principles it espoused, including hereditary nobility and slavery, both predated Locke's involvement and reflected the ideals of the owners. It is a deep error, therefore, to contend that Locke's role in the Carolina constitutions should guide interpretation of his later work, much less liberalism. The matter of the Royal African Company stock has also lent itself to misinterpretation. Beginning in 1672, Charles II put Shaftesbury in charge of the Council on Foreign Plantations, which oversaw England's colonies overseas. Locke was Shaftesbury's personal secretary, and so became the Council on Foreign Plantations official clerk. In 1672 to 73, Charles paid Locke in Royal African Company stock. During this period, the council sought political reform overseas, less power for governors, but mostly did the king's bidding. There's much in these records about African slaves, and Locke's handwriting as clerk transcribes that word over and over. But within 2 years, both Locke and Shaftesbury stopped cooperating with the king and his policies. Shaftesbury had emerged as Charles II's strongest opponent, inasmuch as one could safely criticize the king during that period. Shaftesbury opposed not only the Test Act of 1673, barring both Catholics and dissenters, non-Anglican Protestants, from political office, but also probably a 1674 attempt to create an imperial slave code for England, both of which Charles supported. In 1675, Shaftesbury and Locke co-wrote and published debates in the House of Lords questioning if Charles II sought too much absolute power. Charles ordered the book burned as seditious. Locke fled to France for 4 years for his health, and Shaftesbury ended up imprisoned without trial in the Tower of London. In July 1675, Locke sold his stock in the Royal African Company, and Shaftesbury quickly followed. If the story ended here, we would know little of Locke. He was a minor actor in a political contest dominated by major figures struggling over empire and questions on the nature of power. But the story did not end in 1675, which rather marked an abrupt turning point. From today's perspective, it is easy to think that ideas about human rights and democracy have always existed in some kind or of fully articulated form. Perhaps they are culturally innate. Certainly the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, from the New Testament, inspired Locke and exists in many forms in different cultures. But the broad-based arguments about human rights that emerged in Locke's and others' writings during this period had a very different specific origin. They began as a repudiation of claims of divine and hereditary absolute power. They responded to Charles II's court and council, to ideas articulated and enacted by ministers, politicians, and political thinkers on behalf of royal power. More substantively, Locke and Shaftesbury grew horrified over what they found to be Charles II's oppressive governance of England and its colonies, and also his promotion of slavery. They began to argue that absolutism possessed a common essence and took different forms, of kings over subjects and masters over slaves, but that all forms were wrong. Without his involvement in imperial policymaking, Locke would have never have composed the second treatise, his theory of democratic governance. He wrote it not to propound Stuart ideals and practices, but against them. Compelled by his legal and administrative encounters with slavery, a corrupt colonial government, and a tyrannical monarch, his 2 treatises was a different kind of constitution than the one he had helped to draft for Carolina. Locke's hatred of absolutism and slavery helped to justify the Glorious Revolution of 1688 against James II. That revolution was necessary, Locke contended, because every pulpit in England preached the principles of an advocate for slavery. James II was in fact the governor of the Royal African Company at the same time he was king. Ministers of the Church of England, of which he was head, preached passive obedience to him because he was chosen by God to lead them. During the 1680s, the Royal African Company brought as many as 100,000 people from Africa to England's colonies in the New World. James II was directly involved in that trade in human cargo. Locke's first treatise begins, "Slavery is so vile and miserable an estate of man that 'tis hardly to be conceived that anyone would support it." He attacked the principle of divine and hereditary power methodically. Why should the eldest son inherit all power by primogeniture, even over his brothers? He also compared the king's claims to power to the also illegitimate claims of masters over their slaves. Neither had hereditary and rightful claims. The king might argue that his right to rule descended from Adam, but neither he nor masters of slaves had power over others by such spacious claims. Locke's second treatise speculated about what form of government would emerge in a state of nature. He began with postulates including the Golden Rule and built principles. Government should be based on consent and has particular purposes, mainly to protect its subjects. People do not have to obey a government that no longer protects them. And the consent of an ancestor does not bind the descendants. Each generation must consent for itself. Did any of you sign an agreement when you were born? No, I don't think so. I never remember having to sign, yes, I'll accept the contract. No, didn't get to do that.
In common law, there's implied covenants, so.
Locke supported slavery only as punishment for a terrible crime for which one's life could be forfeit, in particular for starting a war that was unjust. And he insisted that it should never be hereditary. He opposed slavery on the same grounds as hereditary monarchy. People do not inherit their status. Government should be based on the consent of the governed, not on the divine and hereditary privilege. Labor also should be based on consent. The first thing anyone owns and cannot give away is his own person. It is a property, a propriety, a belonging that is higher than any other kind of ownership. Man being born, as has been proved, with the title to perfect freedom and an uncontrolled enjoyment of all the rights and privileges of the law of nature, equally with any other man, hath by nature a power to preserve his property, that is, his life, liberty, and estate. Thus notice it's not life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Remember Jefferson et al. Changed that because they couldn't promise everybody property. So they promise you you'd have opportunity to pursue happiness. You can do that. That'll be fine. I got lost. Where was I?
Hath by nature a power to preserve his property, that is his
Third
life.
sentence.
Down a little bit more. There you go.
Okay. Thus, each person has a right to his own person and labor, a right that includes the ability to contract with someone else. That right is very different from slavery, which is forced labor. I believe a lot of the Irish were contracted themselves. They sold themselves into indentured. But the Irishmen tended to live only 4 years in the New World before they died. And they were terrible slaves. They didn't work very hard, etc. So they were cheap.
They were also the most worthless of slaves. They were
Well,
considered
the
lower
thing is, you're
class
taking them
slaves.
from Ireland, where I think the land is much cooler, and putting them in the Carolinas, which is almost,
You can get trouble.
yeah. However, so after the Glorious Revolution, King William and Queen Mary, where we get William and Mary College and that kind of thing, gradually retreated from many earlier policies that had encouraged slavery. Shaftesbury's political party, the Whigs, gained control over Parliament. Under pressure from them, William III, that's the same William, appointed Locke to a new and more powerful governing council over the colonies, which he called the Board of Trade. It's also a bar in Nome. Sorry, that was a joke, but never mind. There, Locke sat in judgment over many colonial policies. He became particularly concerned about abuses of power in Virginia. Along with other members, he investigated Virginia's laws and constitution. He then wrote a 40-page plan for law reform in Virginia. That plan resides in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, where librarians discovered it rolled into a cubbyhole in his desk when they acquired his papers. It has long been assumed, even though it was in his handwriting and that of his secretary, that he did not write it. I show that he did. His work on Virginia's Constitution reflects Locke's own ideas. That plan for reforming Virginia's Constitution led to a reversal of many of the earlier policies that had promoted hierarchy and slavery. In particular, it admonished that Virginia should no longer follow Charles II's policy of granting masters 50 acres of land for each slave or servant purchased, a policy that had fostered large estates and bound labor. Locke arranged for the appointment of a new governor for Virginia, Francis Nicholson. By court decision in 1699, Nicholson got rid of the land bounty for buying a slave. He sent a copy of that decision back to England next to the report that masters would no longer be rewarded with large estates for the importation of Negroes. Locke responded, "Well done," and you can see it right there in the document. Locke's plan for Virginia specified that all people should have equality under the law. As people of different persuasions enjoy liberty of conscience, so let people of all nations be naturalized and enjoy equal privileges with the other English inhabitants residing there. However, he understood that under English law at the time, most rights belonged only to subjects, and to become a subject, one had to swear an oath of loyalty to the king, and to do that, one had to be a Christian. Locke was also familiar with the English high court decisions that had justified slavery only for aliens. He therefore urged that the children of Negroes and Indians should be baptized, catechized, and bred Christian. By urging their baptism, Locke was undercutting the rationale for slavery. Subjects could claim rights to protections against maiming and assault, to trial by jury, to testify, to own land, and to freedom from forced labor. The High Court decisions affected American colonies then, just as Supreme Court decisions often affect state law today. These judges were appointed and dismissed at the king's pleasure. So King James II could dismiss judges and appoint new ones on his slightest whim, which he did. After the Glorious Revolution, Parliament fired and punished all of James II's judges for corruption. William III appointed completely new judges. In 1696, they reversed the earlier High Court decisions and ruled that no man could own another. That new decision worked hand in hand with Locke's Virginia plan to undercut slavery. Of course, slavery did not end in Virginia in 1699. Locke's actions faced broad political headwinds. After a political crisis that led to the fall of the Whigs in 1700, Locke, who was old and sick, resigned from the board. William III died after a hunting accident in 1702, and his successor, Queen Anne, daughter of James II, whose court idealized slavery as the source of imperial wealth, reversed all of these policies again. Her crowning achievement was obtaining a grant to supply the Spanish Empire with all their slaves for the next 30 years. That contract, the Ascencio, made Britain the main importer of slaves into the New World by 1750. Neither slavery nor colonization had their origins in Locke's two treatises. His ideas about how people could claim rights to property did justify a certain kind of colonization. He argued that by making objects, by farming the land, one could derive ownership, goods and ground. However, his was a more egalitarian ideal of ownership than that offered by King James I's right of discovery by Christian princes who could then grant dominion, the right of ownership and governance. Locke's was founded on individual action, the Stuart kings on divine status. Such attention to historical context matters. These complex debates over justice shaped the early modern world and continue to shape ours. If we pretend that Locke and the Stuart kings were the same and that their policy struggles did not matter, we ignore the impact of our own policies. If we dismiss Locke's ideas as paradoxical, we forget that in these fires were forged not only slavery but also crucial principles of human rights. It is not only that the big questions were fiercely contended, but that small policies often had huge impacts. Reversing Charles II's reward of land for buying slaves was a major move against inequality and injustice, and against the idea that kings could grant dominion over others. So too was his suggestion that all people be naturalized and have equal protections under the law. The effort to compress such fierce disputes into a flat narrative of hypocrisy belies not only the past but the present. The effort to condemn liberalism and Locke as a theory of slavery and oppression, and to see within liberalism the origin of slavery, misrepresents the very essence of his theory, which was about human rights. It silences intense political debates over such rights that had dramatic practical repercussions. Slavery was justified by theories that all people were born to a divinely ordained status, ideas that were harmonious with racism but not defined by that racism. Slavery's origins were in absolutism, not liberalism. Liberalism arose in reaction to slavery. It sought inclusion and defined rights with broad promises, albeit ones that could be open to exclusions. Indeed, one could argue that the breadth of such promises made racism and other forms of prejudice necessary in order to once again justify hereditary hierarchies. But for many others, it opened wide promises of inclusion. The theory itself was one that strained for relative equality under the law for all those who could give meaningful consent. The similarity of these disputes to ones we conduct today becomes more apparent with such context. For example, do rights inhere in all human beings or only in citizens? Abstract philosophical debates emerged from real dilemmas, but also helped to shape policies that affected millions of people's lives. They still do. Quiz question I have for you. Are there more slaves in the United States now than ever before? Of course, that begs several questions. What do we mean by slaves? What if they're illegal? Legally, we don't have slaves. On the other hand, there's lots of different sites that argue that there are more slaves now in the U.S. than ever. Mostly Asian, mostly women. So that's the kind of quiz question we should do some research, right? I had some folks in my other class that emailed me and said, no, I've talked to lots of people, met lots of people, I've never met a slave.
Slave to technology.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, like a literal slave, or like a slave to the technology and internet and gaming, or.
Well, even literal slavery. I mean, like one of the things we've done with our prison systems is that and granted, there is the argument of by doing something illegal, you've given up your rights as a citizen. But at the same time, one of the things we've done with the prison system is reworked into a forced labor system.
It's not forced.
I think
Voluntary.
what I see
Versus like the work crews that
are
run it.
lots of people are offered the opportunity to come to the United States from foreign countries to work. When they get here, they discover they're basically locked in.
Well, this is like contractors.
Like human trafficking,
Yes,
like the sex.
yes.
Not so much human trafficking, but more Asian communities do that. You know, they'll bring over somebody that works for them, and they're kind of like trapped with that family being like their servant.
Yeah. Well, I remember one of my favorite restaurants in town is, well, it's actually Korean, but it's a Chinese restaurant. I mean, they're all Koreans, but it's Chinese menu, which I think is fraudulent too, because I don't think you can eat that kind of food in China. Well, that's just, I'm not sure. But in any case, I remember the people that work there are apparently all members of the same family, but they're clearly not free in the same way that human families, I mean, they are human, sorry, I meant typical American families are. They're very strict with one another. The young definitely owe perfect allegiance to the adults, the older ones. So when you compare the kind of lives that those children lead in that restaurant, and you compare it to, say, the way my kids, or I'm on the phone, are you coming home? They decide themselves, right? Compared to those kids, that feels almost like they're slaves to what's going on in the kitchen. I mean, I've seen them almost in tears because I couldn't understand what was going on because I didn't speak Korean, but I understood that the one girl that brought something out, which was fine, I mean, but then she got yelled at by her mom or the older lady. I don't know if they were actually mother-daughter, but she was in tears over the reprimand, whatever it was. No idea what it was. So that's pretty weird. I felt bad. I felt like I had done something that basically got her in trouble. So that made me feel bad. But it also, I mean, I couldn't imagine the head of the restaurant yelling at any employee in any other restaurant that way. That's clearly a family situation, not. So I don't know if you would even call that way. It could also be the culture, changes the way things are. But so have fun with that one. Look it up. I've gotten some really interesting mixed results. I don't know how well you can trust the sources that you'll find. How do you count illegal slaves? It's clearly a hypothesis, and I suspect a lot of those sources want to make the problem look worse because they're looking for funding, well, from donors for them to try to do what, to fix it, I don't know. So that's kind of interesting. But the other...
They don't live in the city
They wouldn't
anymore.
be there.
The other aspect of this, and my contrast, this, by the way, we'll see her again, and we've seen him again. You get the sense that I like both of these folks. Remember, I have free reign over the syllabus. You have you guys need to cover 2,000 plus years of history. You get to pick. Oh, okay. So I picked this book. I figured, okay, I'll pick these articles. These are. But I also get to pick whatever else we discuss. She is Christina Hoff Summers. Let me talk a little bit about her. By the way, I should have. Do you want the link to this article so that you could reread it or look at it? Did you notice how you can find it? This is on a site that's called AEON. It is a charity, and they send me, I think almost every day, they send me 3 new articles. I don't know how they discover which articles they want to send me, but they're usually written by philosophy professors somewhere, and they're usually pretty well researched and interesting, just like this one. So you could probably just sign up for their emails. You don't have to pay. But if you want, just click on. This was Holly Brewer, chair of American History and associate professor at the University of Maryland. So that's kind of interesting. John?
I thought I found her ascription of the Golden Rule to the New Testament interesting because there's pre-biblical attributions to that. I think Confucius and Hinduism both have sutras or aphorisms or whatever that cover that type of dynamic, and it was just reworded in the Greek version of the New Testament.
Well, in many words, karma basically comes in. I forget what karma's origins are, but it's...
Karma just means actions. So karma just means that the karma of me moving the soda pop over there is that's where the soda pop is, and the karma of you accidentally knocking it over is that it'll spill on the floor. That's just karma. But the other thing I found interesting is that Locke is kind of locked, if you will, in this paradigm where he's stuck between his ideals, right? The ideals that he wants to get going, but he's the secretary, right? So what power does he have? He doesn't really have any power, so he kind of makes friends with the Earl, and who then foments a big political conflict, essentially. And then again, there's this power struggle in England over who's gonna say what is how the world's gonna work, basically, how the empire's wheels are gonna turn. So I think, in a sense, he's kind of an insider trying to create reform within the system. But he's very careful to not get himself beheaded. Otherwise, he would,
Well,
his plot would be foiled.
the way he's
essentially.
horrified by slavery is interesting, because as far as I know, he never left England. So it's not like he ever was in the, involvement in the actual slave trade. I think he ever met a slave.
Right, he just took ownership of these different stocks
So,
that had interest in
Yeah,
slaves.
yeah. So, so I wonder what aspects of what he was doing paperwork-wise,
I think
because he's doing paperwork.
it seemed to me, like I said, is that he was
Albert
trying
Lee.
from the inside to kind of unseat reform the way the situation was at. And the best way you can do that is when you have a certain collateral to deal with. If you have leverage, as it were, political leverage or what have you. So that's why I think it's what she's talking about is people will point to Locke and say, well, he was a slave owner, and he was the progenitor of liberalism, and therefore liberalism equals slavery. Which, we see some revolutionary kind of Civil War era facets of that paradigm trickling in with the Democratic Party, and being associated with the KKK early on. But then there was of course a modern flip of that with Nixon, I believe, where everything kind of flipped around. And
we
they
still
took that
we still
in the
have
60s.
if you think of our various competing meta-narratives today, I kind of would agree that we have lots of competing narratives that compete with one another very much the same way cultures and ethnic groups of people do. In fact, I don't know that you could connect the narratives specifically with those ethnic groups, or I think there's more narratives than that. I've lived through multiple narratives in my own educational experience, so, you believe what you're taught as a kid, and then you go and you get an education of sorts, and you realize that a lot of the things you were taught are wrong, that you no longer believe them, so you now have a new narrative. Then you discover that a lot of your beliefs in that narrative are also wrong, and so in a sense, your educational development seems to be moving from one way of understanding the values of the world to another. But I think you keep some of your most fond values, so I'm sure there's, as I go, and look at these narratives as competing, and these are all man-made, so, it's not that one of the narratives is true. In fact, as soon as you get to the point where you realize they're man-made, you realize, well, they're just cultural interpretations of traditional stories usually, and the values, though, that are embedded in them, they're your values. They're the ones that you grew up liking, and discovering that, well, gee, maybe there's contradictions in this narrative that prevent that particular value from being expressed very well. But that value will continue on. So in the new narrative, when you say that this narrative is better than these, you know, and then if I'm in, you know, I can imagine competing narratives and then still another one, right? So I carry on my favorite values into my new narrative, and the reason I think a particular meta-narrative is more powerful and more just and describes the way the world ought to be, where I'll get my ideals, and explains everything, you know, that's going on, I will consider that to be more powerful because I think it improves the chances that my values are expressed, which could be totally against what someone. So if I'm trying to convince someone from Saudi Arabia that, you know, it's better to live in a society where women have equal rights, etc., you know, they might never accept my meta-narrative because they're so embedded in the view that there's gender differences. You know, so you might think, well, you know, if they go to Oxford and they get an education there, they ought to come away thinking the same as I do. No, they will not, right? You know, in fact, of course, there are teachers like, you know, Tariq Ramadan, who teaches Islam at Oxford, and you know what? He's not on a one-to-one basis with, you know, the typical Oxford Don. You know, he's actually hoping for the day when Islam will take over Europe. You know, and that's, you know, very contrary to what, you know, the other Dons are all for, right? You know, I was thinking of you know, something you said too in your paper was you know, Sam Harris has moved in this kind of a direction, but then he becomes very insistent that he's right in a particular point of view, when actually you can imagine that there would be competing views. I specifically with Sam Harris, I think that he doesn't have, his philosophical training is actually not that good. He's a neuroscientist, actually. And so, you know, if you study the way meta-narratives developed, it doesn't seem like he comes across as knowing about that aspect of our contemporary thinking. So he does think that science is right, and doesn't realize that science is actually a meta-narrative embedded in other meta-narratives.
I think one of the ways I like to think about this is like, how many people watch Star Wars and come away wanting to be a different character, or a different this, or a different that? I don't know, like, you get guys who are Star Wars fans that are absolutely want to be Boba Fett. You get guys who watch Star Wars and want to be Han Solo. You get guys who watch Star Wars and want to be a Jedi. And in many ways, and there's some pretty, I mean, Star Wars is an excellent example of a strong meta-narrative, a very strong narrative, and a very old narrative too, and yet you still have the interpretation problem. And sort of basically it's accounting for personal taste, essentially. It's, you know, maybe you guys for Star Trek. Cool.
No, pop in my list here.
Yeah, I was, you know, you mentioned Star Wars. I was thinking Star Trek, because years ago, you know, Star Trek was a terrific fictional vehicle for teaching this.
Yeah,
You know, at the time, you know, because, you know, these are folks in a ship and they're traveling to other worlds, but they keep meeting different cultures.
Very Odyssey, right?
But at the same time, it clearly delivers the message that the meta-narrative of the Space Federation, you know, with their principles, is basically stronger than all the other ones. Non-interference.
Right.
You know, we can't interfere. You know, we see this place and we have to let it evolve on its own. Right? You know, so we can't break the prime directive, right?
I knew which article that was.
Remember that?
Yeah.
You know, so, but at the same time, you still get the sense that by coming to learn sociology and realizing, think about what a sociologist does. A sociologist that's asked to find out what's going on in a particular situation, they go in and they study, these people think Dunleavy would be a better candidate because they like the language he speaks, etc. These people would like Begich, and I guess you all heard that Walker is withdrawn. So you end up with, the sociologist looking at, who likes these people, right? And then you say, okay, so who do you think, sociologist, is the better candidate? They're like appalled at the question. No, I'm, these people think this and these people think this. Well, who do you think should win? And the sociologist, I'm not part of this. My job is just to describe various societies, what they believe. And so do you know then, after studying all these societies, whether God exists or not? And the sociologist is like, okay, that's the end of this conversation. I'm out of here, because I don't get into that.
Not interested.
Yeah, that's not my job. Right? And it's better that way. It's better that way. So there is a moral narrative to what they're saying. The good sociologist doesn't take sides, right? But well, why is that better? Well, because we ought to let these societies compete with one another. Come election day, we'll find out who has the votes in Alaska, right? Poll takers are different, because they're gonna want to try to earn their money,
So the
tell you who they think is going to win. Right? 5% right or wrong, but we think Dunleavy's going to win, or whatever. Well, let me get back to Christina Hoff Sommers a little.
I have a quick question.
Yes, go ahead.
You made a joke about the foreign gnome. What was it actually? It was called the border trash. What was it?
Board of Trade.
Oh, the Board of Trade in Nome?
Yeah, Board of Trade in Nome is like one of the biggest, well, I would say it's the
I don't know
main
why
bar.
that popped into my head.
Well, I'm from Nome, so I want to tell my aunts that joke.
Well, I got to live in Nome for 6 whole weeks. The very first year I was up here from August and half of September. So I have some fond memories.
The good weather.
It was, although I remembered the air being so sweet. And I asked the one guy that I met on the street, why is the dust so sweet? And he said, it's from the shit, the dog shit of all the, all around. So there was,
Yep.
I even have my Usik from there. Do you know what an Usik is? You from Nome and you don't know what an Usik is?
Well, I moved when I was 10, so I mean, I kind of. But
That's a story and a half, because we were there, and I was in E6, just newly moved to Alaska, didn't have much money, not really. So I was the platoon sergeant of a whole platoon of folks up there. But we had time to spend in the town, and about the only thing at the time where there was the sports club. There were 3 bars, I remember. The Nome Nugget Inn had a bar at the hotel, the Board of Trade, and the Sportsman, I think it was, right? Which, by the way, burned down a couple weeks ago, apparently. So there wasn't a whole lot to do there. My job was mostly to keep the platoon members from getting into trouble. Because the Army, when they sent us up there, they were so afraid that these brutal, nasty Army guys, who were all Russian linguists. So I don't know if you're familiar with Russian linguists, but the Army's thinking that these are brutal Army, NCOs, totally wrong. You know, they're like naive college students, basically, right? So we got up to Nome, and my job was to keep them from getting into trouble, and it turned out to be just the opposite. I had to try to protect them from being brutalized by the town, actually. But so we would look at the gift shops, and the one gift shop had, you know, they had all kinds of things. But there would be people selling things in the town, just walking up and down the street. I imagine there still are.
Like on First
and-
Street, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, and those, of course, were like way cheaper than what the prices were in the gift shops. Well, I remember, you know, I'd be walking along the street and someone would come up behind me and offer me something for $200, and there's no way, you know, they would drop it to 150, and I'm sorry, it would go down to $20, and at $20 you were like, ah, you know, so you would.
How's this one up?
So you would buy it, you know, for $20. Well, the one time I ended up getting, I wanted an Usyk, and I had seen them in the one gift shop, and they had them for like $99 or something. And I thought, you know, wow, what are these? And he explained what they were.
Did he have
you know.
you kiss it first?
Pardon?
Did he have you kiss it first?
No. But so I thought, well, I want one of these. It would be neat. You know, so I could just picture me showing it to my dad and asking him what he thought it was, and then after he guessed, I would tell him. And I just pictured that would be a fun, you know.
What is
Ritual.
an Usyk?
So, walrus penis,
Mm-hmm.
basically.
It's actually quite an interesting. So there.
It looks like a club.
But it's the bone, the penis bone of a walrus, male walrus.
And they fancy it up a bit.
Well, some are carved, some are polished. Well, so I was curious, you know, I would like one, but I didn't want to spend $99 for one. So I said to the guys, hey, if, you know, any of you see someone selling one on the street, you know, offer them, you know, I'll pay like $25 or something for it. Well, the one day I came home, and Sergeant Wacker, no pun intended, that's really his name, I said, hey Bill, didn't you want an Usyk? Well, I got one for you. Oh, where is it? It's under your cot, you know, in the armory. So I went and I pulled out a bag, and it was stinking to high heaven. Because it was apparently a walrus had died. It was on the beach, and
Those beach are fine.
a native went down and apparently cut off, I guess, the head for the tusks, but he also cut off the Usyk and just basically scraped it. You know, so basically it was still raw,
Fresh.
full of, you know, whatever, and horrendous. So Sunday, I had off, so I took I bought a aluminum turkey basin in the store, and a pair of tongs, because I didn't want to touch it. I took it down to the beach, piled up driftwood. Is this interesting? It has nothing to do with what we're doing. You know, so I piled up driftwood, you know, scooped seawater into it, you know, sat it there, put the Usyk in. It wouldn't actually fit. It kept sticking out one end or the other. And I boiled the water, and it's just boiling and boiling and boiling. I was out there all Sunday waiting. The No Nugget Inn bus pulled up, and all the tourists got out, and they came down and they took pictures of me on the beach,
Boiling your Usyk.
boiling my Usyk, you know. I mean, literally, tourists came down and they're like, you know, I suddenly had the feeling, well, I guess I look local. You know? But eventually I put it in a bag, you know, as dried out as I could get it, sent it home. My wife would not open the box. Somehow she knew. She did not even open the box. When I got back home, I opened it and I hung it outside on the eaves for over a year till it completely dried out. And guess what? My dad arrived exactly as I imagined it. I showed it to him. What do you think? He says, "What is this? Some kind of a bone?" And I thought, "It's a walrus dick." It was just absolutely perfect. It's my favorite.
Why
no,
is this
no,
important?
no
Right?
story. However, that has nothing to do with. By the way, the gift shops usually sell like little cards with poems on it. This is a poem about the Usyk. It's hilarious. So that's fun. But let me go to Christina. Summers. And just give you an idea who she is, because she's a feminist, but I suppose you'd call her a second wave feminist. It seems to me last class we never got to third wave, or did I mention third wave? But second wave, those were the ones affected by the social contract, or social construction. They're different than the social contract. But the third wave were basically people that gave up on men and basically said we should kill them all, transform the children so that we don't have male children anymore. So that's the beginning of taking away recess, so you don't get to have, the kind of time that the boys especially like. They started drugging boys to keep them from acting like boys in school, giving them Ritalin and other things. You're familiar with all of that, right? Because if they don't sit still and be quiet in school, then they're obviously got ADD or something. It used to be that those were the healthy boys, so they would drug those so that they wouldn't behave like males. So it was like a feminist attempt to convert our society into a more feminine kind of society, because they thought males are basically the reason for wars. For an awful lot of this is absolutely the case, right? Men do a lot of the fighting, do a lot of the abuse, a lot of the murders, crime. You take away the young males that are between roughly 18 and 40. Is that about the age group where if you get them all off the street, crime just disappears? That the more of them you have, the more crime you have. That's kind of, it's not, obviously not every male is a criminal, but that seems to be where most of the criminals come from. So if we can get them all into the military, yay for us, right? That would be, that might not have been funny, but that was an attempt at humor on my part. It's what a lot of judges actually used to do is, prison or jail, or prison or the military.
They don't do that anymore.
No. Well, part of the reason is you need so much more education and everything to get into the military that, from what I understand, we're having a hard time finding enough young men that are capable of getting in. So that's not good. Well, she wrote a book, Who Stole Feminism? And so she's a feminist, but she's against those women that basically transformed feminist ideals to become basically ridiculous from in her point of view. And one of the books she wrote is The War Against Boys. Shoot, I can just go like this, right?
War Against Boys was in the first paragraph.
Oh, it was?
Yeah. And it's also in our notable works piece.
There it is. So. That's not coming up as a link. Interesting. But the War Against Boys, basically, I remember when I was subbing for the school district. I subbed for the schools for 3 years. I was teaching at UAA, but I remember thinking, why are my students like this? Because they weren't like what I remembered college students being like. And I had the time, so I signed up as a substitute. And for 3 years I did social studies and foreign languages, things of that sort. The one morning they called me, and it was a person instead of the automated device. And it said, "Do you speak Spanish?" And I was honest. I said, "No hablo español," which is no. They didn't understand that, and they said, "Oh, terrific!" And they assigned me to Spanish immersion kindergarten for the day. So, okay, why not? So I spent the day, the one day, I ended up becoming the regular for this. I don't know how that happened, but I ended up doing it multiple times. But the one time it was out at Chugach Elementary. And you know, you have 25 kids, kindergartners, who at recess time will all line up and put on their shoes and stand there in a line waiting for you to tie them. That's 50 shoes. Do you know how much exercise that is? And by the time you're done, recess is over. So the poor kids at the end, you know, aren't even going to get any recess. But I remember the one kid who was the tallest male in the class, and he was just so full of energy that he wanted to do stuff. You know, he's not going to sit on the floor and talk about the sun in Spanish. You know, that's not interesting to him. So I gave him something to do over on a table. There were toys and stuff. He could, you know, go build like Legos or something, right? And he was absolutely thrilled with that and went over and started doing all this stuff. Well, one of the other boys, like, oh, can I do that too? Sure, go ahead. So he went over there. Well, guess what? The big boy didn't want anyone else playing with what he was playing with, so he popped the other one. And, you know, crying, etc., etc. So, you know, all kinds of fun with that. But I remembered at the end of the day, that it has, if you've ever been to that school, it has a door on the outside of each classroom too, right? The mother comes charging in. She says, "What did he do today?" And she was all concerned. And I knew immediately which mother that was. And I said, "Don't let them drug that boy. He's the healthiest boy in here." Maybe that was wrong to say, because I'm not a psychologist. I'm not trained. You know, I'm just reading books like hers that convinces me, whoa, this is a healthy boy. And he's really in need of more activity than just sitting here.
Going through a normal
Yes,
behavioral pattern
yes.
according to his age, his developmental maturity.
But they are a little, and I've had, of course I mentioned my one son who had fetal alcohol. They threw drug after drug at him to try to get him to settle down, etc. A lot of them caused him to gain weight, grew breasts at one point. You imagine all kinds of stuff. But none of it helped, actually, because it was fetal alcohol. So, however, so she's absolutely fascinating to me. She's conservative. By the way, she was one of the ones that relatively recently was invited to speak at Berkeley, and the student body basically had a yelling fest to try to prevent her from being able to speak. Sad, but she was, I'm sure she would be well worth listening to.
Isn't that very strange that's happening in places where people don't want to hear, they like so badly don't want to let people speak? I don't understand that, honestly. I hear
It
about that
seems
a
like
lot.
they're convinced that just hearing the people say the things that are relatively conservative will harm them. Being in the audience and hearing their arguments.
But wouldn't they just not
is bad.
know then? can't you just not go if you don't, like, I don't
They're-
understand the.
They wanna go to try to prevent the people who say those things from being there. Charles Murray's another one. I don't think it's happening that often, but it's happened a couple of, you know
Well,
how
like
our
I said, I
news tries
used
to make it
to,
out to be.
I used to live in Washington, and like that Evergreen thing happened there, and so I've been kind of following what happens.
What was the Evergreen?
Oh, where with Brett Weinstein, there was,
My goodness,
they,
I'm not
they,
familiar with.
you should look it up. It's,
Maybe you could email me.
I'll
later.
email you some stuff, some links, and there was a bunch of stuff that happened there. I think the school's closing now, actually.
Which school was it?
It's Evergreen College.
Oh, Evergreen College?
Mhm. In Washington, it's in like Olympia area.
Yeah, as far as I know, we haven't had any problems here like that.
No, I haven't noticed it here, but like if you go online and there's a lot of speakers that don't get to speak, there's like riots to prevent them from speaking. And with the case of Brett Weinstein and stuff, they actually held the president and Brett Weinstein, they like held them hostage, kind of. They wouldn't let them go to the bathroom.
Oh my
They like kept them locked in a room. It was craziness.
And it seems silly because the narrative that we think is the strongest is the one that says you should be open to diversity. I mean, frankly, the reason, and France, I think, would be the perfect place to see how this works. France, you have to be secular in France. It's the law. We don't have that. But in France, you're required to be secular. You can't, like wear a burqa, for example, on the beach and things of that sort, a burkini, right? If you're a nun, that's okay, because, well, let's not get into that. Yeah, but so they allow folks to come there, and they give you 2 years to learn the language, etc. And they're apparently open to diversity, right? But it's clear that they expect you to become educated, and once you become educated, you become French. And so you lose whatever that previous point of view is. So you're expected when you move to France that you're going to give up this ethnic set of beliefs and eventually become French, become secular. Hasn't been working very well because they've had so many come at once that they end up with neighborhoods of these ethnic groups that then basically create the third world country in Paris, in that neighborhood. And that's been a problem for them, trying to figure out how to fix that. Because what the assumption is that everybody that comes to France, within at least a generation, if not before that, you become just like everyone else. There was a philosopher in France just recently that yelled at a woman in an interview on TV, saying it's a shame your parents gave you that name because it's not French, it's an insult to France. She was born in France, but the parents gave her a name that was from the other culture. By the way, that guy gets in trouble for saying things like that. So France has rules. You gotta be careful. But you had something?
I remember reading with the French Foreign Legion not too long ago, and that kind of explained some of their strangeness. They had some problems of their own.
I remember the Catholic Church was actually illegal for a while in France during the Revolution. Priests and monasteries, all that stuff was banned. Although now, of course, they realize, well, there goes our tourists. So, okay, we better take a break, I guess. Sorry. You guys having fun?
A blast.
This is fun. This is a blast.